For want of a nail the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe the horse was lost. For want of a horse the rider was lost. For want of a rider the message was lost. For want of a message the battle was lost. For want of a battle the kingdom was lost. And all for the want of a horseshoe nail. At first glance this seems overdramatic, losing a kingdom all for the want of a horseshoe nail, but there's a resonance for this in military science. Small things that would never sink a kingdom or nation on their own cause ripples, setbacks which feed into even larger misfortunes, which eventually culminate in utter ruin. Skilled generals notice where their enemies are weak and make plans accordingly. Noticing where your enemy is facing difficulty and attacking there is straight out of Sun Tzu's Art of War. Thus, armies and nations need to keep the small things in mind so they don't become larger problems that eventually lead to defeat and ruin. The perfect example of this would be the Russian campaign of the Swedish king Charles XII, a moment that would be considered the beginning of the end for the mighty Swedish Empire and the rise of Russia under the auspices of Tsar Peter the Great. This is the Battle of Poltava. The late 17th and early 18th century were a very active time for warfare on the European continent. The Ottoman Sultan Mustafa II had been campaigning in Hungary in the mid-1690s. Great Britain and France were embroiled deeply in the War of Spanish Succession, so the three big powers of Western Europe were all fighting in the West. In the north, the mighty Swedish Empire was now the dominant power, controlling much of the Scandinavian peninsula and the area we now call the Baltic countries. Opposing them was a coalition of regional powers threatened by Sweden. The Union of Denmark-Norway, both the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Electorate of Saxony, which were controlled by Augustus the Strong, and the Tsardom of Russia. Now Russia, for a long time in European history, was considered a backwater, a large regional power to be sure with a lot of manpower, but they were very ill-educated and technologically backwards. That changed in the 17th century. Russian expansion into Ukraine, under Tsar Alexei I, had brought a lot of Western ideas and thinkers into Russia through the Academy at Kiev. One member of the Russian court who immediately latched on to these ideas was Alexei's son with his second wife Natalia, Pyotr. Pyotr, or Peter as it's anglicized, would be enamored of Western thinking, through introductions into Greater Russia through Kiev, through his father hiring Western tutors for him to include 2 Scottish Catholics, and through his own personal friendships with Westerners who were in the foreign quarters of Moscow. This meant that when Peter took control of the Tsardom in 1696, he looked to reform and modernize his country and his military. These efforts had actually started back before with Tsar Mikhail, and Alexei made sure to improve his own army with modern techniques and equipment. Peter himself was looking to continue this great tradition. His idea, however, was to bring Russia fully into the modern age with a modern army and a modern navy. To get this, he needed ports, as Western Russia only had holdings on the White Sea, which was frozen for much of the year. He struck Ottoman holdings in the Black Sea to get himself a naval base at Azov, and was now looking towards the west, at the Baltics, which were currently held by Sweden. Sweden itself was commanded by a young king, Karl, or as it's anglicized, Charles XII. At the outset of war in 1700, which was called the Great Northern War, Charles wasn't even 18 years old yet, and he faced a multi-front war. The anti-Swedish coalition had hoped to attack Sweden when it was headed by a young, inexperienced, untested king, and break the power of this great northern juggernaut. It's not a bad strategy. Attack your enemy when and where they're weak. However, the coalition misstepped greatly, because Charles XII was an excellent commander and conducted a brilliant campaign even at a young age. He bypassed the Danes using his navy, called upon his allies in England and Holland, and bombarded the Danish capital of Copenhagen. In a dazzling display of maneuver, Charles knocked Denmark-Norway right out of the war before the Russians could even get their army able to deploy in the north. They were still in the south handling the peace arrangements with the Ottomans to secure Peter's new port on the Black Sea. Charles then ferried his troops across the Baltic to Narva and attacked Peter's army that was besieging the city. Peter had wanted to modernize his army, and he was making progress towards this goal, but in 1700 his army was still barely trained. That isn't to say it was all doom and gloom for Peter. His army was truly massive, taking advantage of Russia's huge size and population. Charles himself was outnumbered about 3-1, but under the cover of a raging blizzard, Charles advanced very close to Peter's forces, divided them up, and forced a rout. The Russians retreated in such numbers that the bridge to escape collapsed under the weight of the retreating troops. King Charles then seized the Russian army's equipment and left Russia dangerously ill-equipped and exposed, again in another brilliant display of maneuver. So let's look at the scorecard here. Charles throws 2 punches, and he knocks one member out of the coalition and defangs another one. Let it be said, Charles XII was a very good general indeed. Fortunately for Peter, Charles turned to fight against Augustus of Poland, and had spent 6 years fighting him to the point of leaving Russia almost completely alone. Deposing Augustus the Strong was a deeply held goal of Charles, as he wanted to put the crown of Poland on someone who was going to be a Swedish ally, not a Swedish enemy. That's not to say there was no action between Sweden and Russia during those years. Russia regrouped their shattered armies and recruited some more men, and then Peter began a process of building fortresses in the region so that he could better hold the territory. One such fortress, the Peter and Paul Fortress, would later be the citadel and foundation of St. Petersburg, which would later become Peter's capital and a monument to Peter's vision of a westernized Russia. Even today, St. Petersburg is one of the most culturally significant cities in Russia, if not the entire world. Peter used these fortresses to check Swedish raids and incursions in 1704 and 1705, and these fortresses would prove their worth as staging grounds and rally points for Peter to defend his territory. Finally, in 1706, King Charles was finally successful in his campaign against Augustus, deposing him and leaving Peter to face Charles and his fierce Swedish army alone. Peter was not idle in those 6 years, especially when it came to his army. His new army was finally drilled and trained in the latest firearms techniques, and they were leaps and bounds better than his previous 1700 army at Narva. Peter also recruited a large force of cavalry. These troops were trained in a signature-defining tactic and technique of this era. They were trained in the art of the dragoon. Now, the dragoon was a mounted soldier trained to act as both infantry and cavalry as the situation dictated on the battlefield. They also acted as a reconnaissance force and a minor field engineer. They weren't given the high status of the normal cavalry soldier and were instead treated as mounted infantry. After all, that was originally their role. They were infantry forces who used horses to quickly deploy to battle lines for extra mobility. As the dragoon age progressed, they needed to learn how to fight from horseback in the event of cavalry engagements. Charles and Peter would both make extensive use of dragoons during the Swedish invasion of Russia. However, Charles was still expected to crush Peter just as he had crushed everyone else in this war. In 1707, Peter even offered a truce, offering all of the territory he occupied with the exception of Peter and Paul Fortress, but Charles refused, wanting instead to take out Russia and force a surrender on much more favorable terms. Charles took his army, so recently victorious in Saxony, and invaded Russia with 40,000 men, 20,000 infantry, and 20,000 cavalry. Charles's strategy was reminiscent of the tactics he used against Denmark-Norway, a fast army meant to attack his forces before they could prepare themselves. These maneuvers can be quite risky, but using shock, chaos, and a local force majority can allow a well-trained army to strike with success against far larger opponents. This has been done throughout history. Alexander the Great used his ability to maneuver quickly and strike forcefully to take out the Achaemenid Empire of Persia, which was then the largest empire in the world. Peter had much the strengths that Darius III of Persia did against Alexander, a massive army that was spread out over large territory. Peter had his own strategy, one that would be played out against Western invaders into Russia both before this time and after: scorched earth. Peter had recognized that he needed to sap the strength of the Swedish steamroller. Russia has, throughout its history, used delaying tactics, destroying the ability for invaders to forage and letting their punishing climate fight against any invader. It would happen against Napoleon and against Hitler, but before either of these two, it would do its magic against Charles and the invading Swedes. Peter would drive cattle away, seize the stores within granaries, and burn unharvested crops in the field so as to deny Charles's army the chance to sustain their army at top strength on Russian soil. This would not be a simple or easy affair. The city of Batov would be mercilessly slaughtered by the Russian army, with all of the grain, livestock, and weapons stolen or burned. Even so, Charles's army pressed inward, winning several early victories. The area that is now Ukraine was pressured by the new king of Poland, Stanislaus Leszczynski, installed by Charles when he defeated Augustus the Strong. This put pressure on Cossack lands, who had held that region with broad autonomy for close to 200 years. Peter had elected to withdraw from the Cossack lands in order to pursue a scorched earth strategy, and this didn't sit too well with their hetman, Ivan Mazepa. Ivan Mazepa is a fascinating historical tale. He had been fearing the loss of autonomy that had come from Peter's centralization efforts for some time now. Ivan had made a name for himself as a skilled general, and had uncovered a secessionist effort that enabled him to get elected to the hetmanate. Since then, though, he had become one of the wealthiest landowners in Eastern Europe. Peter, however, was renegotiating the Cossack treaties. Now the Cossacks were fighting in offensive campaigns in foreign lands rather than simply in defensive wars, as had been previously outlined. That would be bad enough on its own, but Russian commanders were frequently sending the Cossacks into costly charges, and there was some talk about replacing their traditional leader, the hetman, with a Russian general. Ivan was starting to get very anxious about his future, especially as the Poles allied with Charles advanced. Charles scored fantastic victories against the Russians by taking advantage of poor coordination and his own technological superiority. He pushed them back and back, further into Russian territory, hoping to defeat them and force a surrender on his own generous terms. The Russians would lose their city of St. Petersburg and would have to give up buffer territory to protect the Swedish Empire against later Russian incursion. Yet even as Charles and his allies won against the retreating Russians, the pressure began to mount on the Swedes. The Russians had an overwhelming manpower advantage and could replace any fallen troops with local reinforcements, while the invaders had long lines to replace their losses, and long marches and combat have a way of eating through the calories rather quickly. In a prediction of what Napoleon would experience about 100 years later, the cold set in. The winter of 1708 and 1709 was one of the coldest on record for Europe in the past 500 years. While the many who would die of famine during this great frost would curse the weather, Peter certainly was thankful for the additional pressure that it put on Charles' invading army. As an additional blow, the Russians scored a fantastic victory at Lesnaya, commanded by one of the most colorful characters of Russian history in this time period, Alexander Menshikov. The popular story of Menshikov was that he was the son of a dock worker and he sold stuffed buns. One of Peter's friends noticed this bun man's wit and introduced him to the Tsar. What was more likely is that Alexander was the son of impoverished minor nobility and genteel poverty, who was recommended as a contemporary by one of Peter's Western allies. Now, the story does make it much better, but either way, Menshikov was a man who excelled at everything he did, including corruption. He would be infamous for his corruption to test the limits of even Peter's extraordinary patience. The victory at Lesnaya did not inhibit the Swedish march, but what it did do was cause the Swedish armies to burn much of their wagons and take only what they could, exacerbating an already difficult supply problem and spreading fear and panic. Charles had lost a lot at Lesnaya: food, clothing, medicine, and ammunition. It's said that after Lesnaya, Charles's troops were using on average about half of the normal gunpowder charge for their weapons. Up until this point, the Swedish army had been winning their battles despite the difficulties that they had been facing. But with this victory, Menshikov had given Charles's army more than just a bloody nose, but a very real sense that their victory was not as inevitable as they had perhaps hoped. As the winter came to an end, Charles XII found a new lifeline in Ivan Mazepa, who had decided to rebel against Peter. The final nail in the coffin had come when Ivan had heard rumors that he was going to be replaced with Peter's close friend and the man who had just been victorious at Lesnaya, Alexander Menshikov. Mazepa, and I really don't know how to pronounce this name, and I'm sure any Russian listeners will probably give me an earful for how to, but anyway, however you say his name, he was looking to transfer Ukraine to be a Swedish province, with himself remaining as the hetman. Instead of giving his new friend the van, Charles relegated the Cossacks to guarding the rear and the baggage train, keeping the glory for his Swedish cavalry. In need of supplies, Charles marched his army, now about half the size it was when it started, to the fortress of Poltava, with hopes of securing the valuable fortresses and everything within the larder for himself. Peter established a fortified camp to house his massive 80,000-strong army just a few kilometers north of the fortress, buttressed by the Vorska River. To defend the passes, Peter commanded a series of quick earthenwork redoubts, which are small fortified advance positions to house cannons provide a small defensive work for an advance. Ideally, these redoubts would provide flanking fire on the Swedish lines of march and slow Charles's march significantly. This is very similar to the way a jetty is built to break up the force of an ocean wave against a harbor. Behind those redoubts, Peter deployed his cavalry and loyalist Cossack forces under Menshikov, ready to advance quickly should the opportunity present itself. And as if it were a sign, 1 week before the battle actually began, Charles XII got shot in the foot while he was observing the Russian positions. The injury was so bad that Charles could not stand, and he was forced to turn over his command to his field marshal, Renskild. And I'm sorry to any Swedish listeners if they're listening if I've butchered that name even worse than I've butchered some other ones. I do the best I can. It was one small thing, but just as the supply shortages in the cold winter leading to many of his troops succumbing to disease and frostbite, these small things had a way of adding additional burdens to Charles's forces. On the morning of 8 July, Charles finalized his attack plans. In the pre-dawn hour, the Swedes would bypass the redoubts from the south and carry out a night attack in an unexpected direction. This is not a bad idea. He bypasses the redoubts where they're strongest. Renskild was hoping to inflict a demoralizing defeat against the Russians, seize the redoubts for his own use, and secure the march for a greater portion of the Swedish column. The forces selected were infantry and cavalry, but Renskild had decided that the field guns were too slow to advance, so he didn't have artillery support for this phase of the operation. It's also speculated that the decision had less to do with the mobility of the Swedish guns and more to do that the Swedish gunpowder shortage from the heavy field pieces made them less useful to be deployed at that time. 2 hours before dawn, though, half of Renskild's army was missing. The cavalry had gotten lost during the night march. Now this seems very confusing to modern people, but in the age before satellite networks and GPSs, getting lost was a very real concern in warfare. Entire columns could get swallowed up in the inky darkness of night. Without the ability to communicate using torches or horns, since that would give away the attack, nighttime operations were significantly risky. Just getting lost and being unable to carry out the attack was not the worst thing to happen in those eras, although it was bad enough. A lost nighttime force could wander out into an exposed position and be shelled with artillery once dawn arose. This happened a lot during World War I, when the power of artillery bombardments on roadways meant that reinforcements and supplies needed to be moved at night. A night force could also blunder into sentries and alert the enemy army that there was something going on. And that's exactly what happened here. A reconnaissance patrol was discovered by Russian sentries, and one was able to get a warning shot with a pistol to let the Russians know the Swedish were coming. Unable to hide his presence any longer, Renskild ordered an assault by his troops, assembled into 4 columns, to take the redoubt, and this assault continued well past dawn. The columns on the wings fared very well, taking the lead redoubts quickly and massacring the defenders. These columns were under the direct supervision of the senior field commanders. Renskild commanded the left, and the wounded Charles XII carried in a litter, and his infantry commander, Adam Lewenhaupt, commanded the right. However, the third column, the one on the center right, became isolated and slightly turned off course. Menshikov noticed this and deployed his cavalry against the unsupported unit. The Swedish cavalry, hearing the battle, attempted to assist, but they emerged on the wrong side of the battle, and they were cut off from the attack because they were blocked by their own infantry. They couldn't just run over their own troops. This attack was a tremendous success, and the cavalry only withdrew in the order of Peter, because at the low dawn hour visibility, combined with the smoke and the dust from the guns and the horses, meant that Peter couldn't perceive the battle from his own unit's position, and so he gave an ill-advised order to withdraw. Now that battle was joined, the infantry from the right wing looked to consolidate and moved over to support the left wing, and doing so, they took a withering barrage of gunfire from the Russian redoubts. However, This put that right wing out of command range from the isolated center-right column, that third column that was just attacked by the cavalry. Peter saw this and ordered Menshikov, while he was withdrawing, to charge again with all speed. This move stunned the Swedish in the third column. They had thought that the Russians had withdrawn because of a flank attack, and these new horsemen were actually their own Swedish cavalry. Menshikov's quick action broke the third column and sent them into complete disarray. Their general, General Rus, escaped with about 400 men. Much of his army was killed and the rest was captured. This was a devastating loss for the Swedish forces. They lost about 30% of their infantry before the main battle action had even begun. This was the shoe that lost the horse. The left had advanced to its position by around 6 a.m., and here they were waiting to regroup with the third column before pushing forward as per the original battle plan. They didn't know that the third column had been destroyed piecemeal by Menshikov. This delay cost the Swedes any chance of having momentum over this battle. Peter noticed this and ordered his infantry to deploy to the front lines, and because of the Swedish delay, they had time to get into position. Peter then ordered his artillery to start shelling the Swedish forces where they were waiting to attack with his heavy cannons. Renskiold began to move his units around to defend against the artillery barrage, but when it became obvious that the third column wasn't coming, Renskiold ordered an attack, and the Russians changed their artillery rounds, where before they were firing cannonballs, now they were firing canister shot. Canister shot is essentially an oversized shotgun round. The round is contained in a large canister, that's where it gets its name, and this canister is filled with small metal balls. They're fired with the force of a cannon behind it, and these balls inflict horrific damage, tearing men to pieces. Aerodynamics makes the range of a canister shot very short compared to solid shot cannonballs or even explosive shells, but against massed infantry, such rounds were devastating. It was the pinnacle of anti-personnel warfare in the age of the field cannon. Fired at the Swedish left, the Russian artillery inflicted devastating losses. Seeing all these losses, Renskiold ordered a great charge with both musketeers and pikemen, forcing his men to the Russian positions to seize the cannons in the front rank. This attack was successful, but at a very heavy loss. Peter saw his front line break, and his second rank was in trouble, so he ordered an advance of the Novgorodsky regiment. This quick action saved the second rank at the cost of many Novgorodsky lives. Peter then arranged his forces into the classical Knie, with his infantry units formed into hollow squares, and his cavalry swooped in on the wings to attack. The Swedish cavalry was blocked by their own infantry, then they were killed, so they weren't able to attack, and the Ukrainian Cossacks were in the rear, so Peter had an overwhelming advantage in cavalry. This mobility was exactly what Peter needed to overwhelm and collapse the remaining Swedish infantry lines as they were attacked from multiple directions. The envelopment was nearly complete, and the Swedish command structure broke down, relegating the Swedish army to individual, uncoordinated unit action. Very few of those who were actually engaged escaped to retreat to the woods. Among those who did was the wounded Charles XII and the Cossack turncoat Ivan Mazepa. The two would flee and seek asylum in the Ottoman Empire with the Swedish reserve forces and other Cossacks. The field marshal, Renskiold, was captured and would later die in a Russian prison, and many of the Swedish prisoners would be sent to Siberia. The Ukrainian Cossacks would lose their autonomy, and Russia gave a new dramatic statement as to the rising power of the Russian Tsardom. This would be the pivotal turning point for the Great Northern War. Denmark would re-enter the war. Great Britain would join with Prussia on the side of the anti-Swedish coalition. You'll remember that before they were on Sweden's side. France would not enter the war, but their king, Louis XIV, made a strong alliance with Peter the Great, giving him the Western connections that he always desired. The Great Northern War would last for another 12 years, but Peter was able to defeat the mighty Swedish juggernaut almost completely on his own, in a stunning upset that no one thought possible. 12 years later, in 1721, the Swedish Empire would be broken. Peter destroyed the Swedish forces by pressuring his enemy and taking advantage of Swedish mistakes. No one factor caused the Swedes to lose at Poltava. If they had their supplies, they might have been able to effectively fight. If Charles wasn't wounded, he might have been able to command more effectively. If the third column hadn't been destroyed thanks to a loss of communication, the Swedish assault might have happened earlier, before Peter could deploy his solid infantry line. If the Swedish cavalry hadn't been lost and pinned, they might have been able to counter the force of Menshikoff's dragoons. So perhaps that old poem isn't as melodramatic as it seems. After all, for want of the supplies, the army was lost. For want of the army, the Battle of Poltava was lost. And for want of the battle, the Swedish Empire was lost. Thanks for listening.